When Jesus walked the roads of Galilee, he had often seen the ravages of death. This dead man's father had passed away when he was still a child. His mother, no doubt, showered her son with love and affection and protected him from harm as best she could. They lived with undivided attention from the community. She either never felt like exploring the opportunity for remarriage, or maybe perhaps it never became her option to explore. When this son of hers became a teenager, he found employment to bring in much needed income to help defray their living expenses, particularly because the economy in which they existed and the spirit of the culture attached meaning and wage earning to male labor predominantly. It must have been pretty good conditions for them, and they expanded relationship connections and became pretty well known in this little town called Nain. This town was but 2 miles from Mount Tabor, just a little southwest of Nazareth. And we know from both the Old and the New Testament that life was extremely difficult for a widow who would suffer and endure oppression and injustice simply because they were widowed. Widows lived intimately connected to poverty. They found themselves existing often on the fringes of the community, surviving one day to the next, and God had ordained that widows in Israel should receive protection and that they should receive care. In fact, where widows were exploited, God promised to be a powerful protector. Don't know if her son became unexpectedly sick and died in short order, or was there an illness stretched out that she watched ravage her son's body and then transition him, unfortunately, from life temporal to life eternal. Whatever the case, illness took this son out. No doubt the mother is now shattered. She's lost the breadwinner, not to mention her only offspring, and lest we forget, she's already lived through the unfortunate loss of her husband. When the town learned of this death, they rallied around her, participating, in fact, in funeral arrangements, filling in where they could and where they thought it might be most helpful, and to help her grieve and to ensure that she doesn't make this journey to the cemetery by herself. She's headed to bury her son, surrounded by many in and from her community. At least 6 young men are carrying the coffin, and when they hit the city gate, it's at the same time that Jesus and his disciples are entering the city. Jesus stops the procession, and apparently he engages this woman in conversation and is told of her double misfortune: husband and only son gone. Life looking bleak in the future, emotionally devastated, grieving beyond compare. And the text says Jesus's heart goes out to her. And strangely, he says to her, "Don't cry." And we know by the physician Luke's account what follows. He touches the coffin, he brings the boy back to life, presents him alive to his mother in the presence of the crowd, to the dismay of the death angel. And I don't know precisely why Jesus chose, of all that he could have said, that he decided these words were important for her to hear: "Don't cry." Why not say, "Fear not," or "Your mourning will turn to laughter," or "Do you believe in me, but don't cry"? How can she not cry when her world has crumbled seriously? Her economy has tanked. Her economic stability will be laid in a cemetery, at least in the patriarchal context in which she resides. She's lost husband and now only son, and you and I know, don't we, that amidst all that swirling processing, there are equal questions. How could God be so cruel? What could God want out of my suffering like this? She knew that all this support would soon wane when relatives and friends, those in the community, go back to their normal flow and routine, leaving her likely with no help or support at all. And all Jesus says to her is, don't cry. What intrigues me even more than that is this: people died in Nain often just like they did in towns and villages that surrounded Nain. Death was normal. Cemeteries were visited often and coffins were carried there customarily. So why did Jesus' heart go out to her? And the only explanation the text provides to us, that Jesus must have decided to move on her behalf and to raise her son, because the story she shared that revealed to Jesus in a way that Luke had to mention it must have touched his heart. Jesus found out she was not just a grieving mother of a dead son, but she's the grieving wife of a dead husband. Her story, Jesus felt, was too full of potential to change others' hearts. If he would insert a miracle in this marching crowd headed to the cemetery, her story is just right to let my power draw people around here to the throne of God. It was not the dead son that made Jesus intervene, nor was it the dead husband that made Jesus intervene. It was not the supportive crowd's requests or religious leaders' suspicions that made Jesus act. It was the woman's story that provoked him to act, because her story did something in his heart, and his heart went out to her, and he touches the coffin and raises the boy as a result of it. Every one of us is a walking disclosure of God's character and action in our lives, inserted powerfully in the stories that define who we are and where we are right now in life. And I know there are portions of all of our stories that we wish we did not have to own. The parts that cause so much confusion and pain, that revealed our unreadiness and perhaps our ill-preparedness, our impulsive decisions and our selfish ambitions. Parts of all of our stories that represent paying way too much attention to people's ideas and opinions and too little attention to the Holy Spirit's nudgings and urgings. Parts of our stories that are so painful to rehearse and traumatic to remember, too embarrassing to own and too shameful to admit. And we wish that spiritual growth meant rewrites to our story, or intense edits, or deleting where necessary. But I'm forced to remind us that when it comes to your story, you don't get a chance to rewrite it, you cannot edit it, and you cannot delete it. You've got to own it. You're not a Christian who has a rewritten story. You're a Christian who has a chapter that introduced the most significant character in your whole drama to your lived experience, and that's Jesus. He doesn't rewrite your story. He pivots it. His heart is stirred over portions of your story. His blessings are bestowed because of parts of your story. His protection is provided. His hedge is fortified because of parts of your story. And every one of us is walking with Jesus in a very real sense because of the way he listened and moved after sharing our story with him. I want you to look at how his blessings and power and grace and miracles are extended in response to the uniqueness of your story. And that's why you have to own your story. You can't be ashamed of your story. You can't sidestep it. You cannot ignore it. You've got to walk your story. You have to bear your story. You have to live knowing that your story is important to Jesus. I can look at the uniqueness of my story and then make sense out of why I confessed Jesus when I did, and why the Lord extended the call to me at 17 and not at 27, and why Morgan State University inadvertently lost my tuition in the computer system, and why I was never but so good at basketball, and why I was hit on a bicycle in a spot where I was thrown to plush grass and not upon hard cement, and why I could see the killing intent of police officers in their eyes on that late summer morning at 2:30 a.m. while less than 3 miles from my own house, returning from preaching in Baltimore. And the officer looked at me, pulled me over, and said, "I pulled you over because you look like you were evading me." And when I never even saw him, not speeding, not swerving, but driving way too late in a car that in his mind I should not possess or own. And I know why. God made that police officer hesitate and pivot from what I knew was his harmful and his destructive intentions. I know why I carry the limitations I do, and I also know why I possess the gifts that I possess. And I'm just simply trying to tell all of us that there is no part of your story that is not connected to Jesus' heart. He is touching areas of your life because of it. He's shaping you because of it. His heart for your story is why he has opened the doors he has opened and given you the access he's provided and the connections and opportunities that he's extended. And it's important for you to hear me this weekend, because this widow is on the road to Nain, headed to the cemetery, and you are on your way down the road that explains your lived priorities. And rather than trying to hop in and out of your story to avoid parts and change others, no, step fully into your story and own it and pay attention to it. In fact, own it enough that you're not afraid to share it with others. Yes, this is who I am, and yes, this is what I've been through, and yes, this is what I battle with, and yet this is what is following me, because it explains so much of how and why and in which way the Lord is leading your life. It explains why you're smiling through your tears. It explains to people why you have a "I can't give up" attitude. It tells people why every time you fall into a pit, you don't fall into despondency, because God has proven to you over and over again through your own story that he can make a way, that he can supply needs, that he can turn circumstances around. Can I tell you that the status, the pressure, the pain, the push, the fight, the natural inclinations, the passion, the gifts, the things you're drawn to, the things you don't even understand why you don't like them, all of it is a part of your story, and they explain where Jesus' heart is especially open towards you. Do I have any company here? Let me tell you something. Where you come from and what you go through and what you carry and the demons you're trying to outrun and the burdens you bear and the weight you lift and the threats associated with your life, that's your story. You don't owe any explanation for any of it, but you do have to learn to accept that Jesus' heart is especially predisposed for you because of all that is a part of your story. What part of it don't you like?